So I wanted to try my hand at custom lockpick making. So I decided to start out by just trying to work on mastering making handles. I chose a Law Lock Tools Valerian pick. The handle on it, there's no handles on these, and the handle's not very wide, so it's very small for my hands. So my goal was to make a handle that was wider and more comfortable for my hand. I chose to use pine as the wood because I felt it would be easy to work with for my first attempt. Hope you enjoy this video. So the first step was to take the two scales that I had cut and selected to use as my handles, and then lay out the pick on top of that, trace out the pick onto the wood. I then went to and figured out where the center was, and then used my drill press to essentially drill the holes through the planks. What I did first was tape the two scales together so they would not shift or move while I was using the drill press on them to put the holes through. Once I had the holes through, I took the rivets that I was going to be using for this handle and put them through the wood and then tightened them up to make sure things all still aligned properly and that the rivets were right in the middle of the pick outline so that everything would line up nicely. So the next step was to take the actual pick, the metal, and punch a hole where the top post is, and then because the Law Lock Tools, the Law Lock Tool Valerian pick has a slot in it, I had to figure out where the rivet would come through, and then essentially just widen that just a tiny bit so that the rivet could come through without a problem. So the first hole I made, I used an actual metal punch, which is shown in step 2, part 2. And then once that hole was made, I was able to line that up with the rivets and put the entire pick together just to check that everything aligned up the way I expected and wanted it to, which is what you see in step 2, part 4. So once I had the pick and the handle kind of lined up with the rivets, I took the metal out, put the rivets back into the handle, and then I began to shape the pick handle the way I wanted it. So I did all my rough shaping where I was taking off the majority of the material and get the curves in using a belt sander that you see in step 3, part 1 on the picture. I took that handle then to the vise. I'm using leather straps to wrap the handle so that the vise itself is not bruising the wood or making any marks on it. And I just went over the pick a bit more to get more of the curves the way I wanted them and to have things meet up the way I expected to. I started out with 120 grit sandpaper strips, moved it to 240, and then finally ended with 400, just a little bit. Once I was done with that part, I put the metal back into the pick, put the rivets back in just so I could see how it looked in general. It's by no means finished yet, but I wanted to get the general sense that the pick, the top of the pick at the shaft base, where it meets the handle, was lined up nicely and that it had a good look, which is what you see in step 3, part 3. So because I went with a wider handle than the pick itself is, I had a couple of choices to make. I could just put epoxy on and let the epoxy fill in the gaps on either side of the pick in between the two handle scales. But I wanted to go with a look where metal came all the way out to the edge of the pick handle, and it also kind of gave it a two-tone look so that the metal going out to the edge of the pick handle matched the brass rivets that were in the pick handle holding it together. So I went with I took out a piece of brass and basically penciled on the shape with the pick laying on top. Penciled that all off and then started doing some cuts. I used a Dremel at first and a cutting wheel to get the major cuts off, which is what you see in step 4, part 1, and did some of the cuts down the center, essentially where the actual pick handle would sit inside of that filler piece of metal. That's what you see in step 4, part 3. So after I got that initially cut, I took it to the vise again, putting it in the vise and going over it with actual files to basically bring down and closer to the actual outline I had made for it, to get it closer to the actual shape of the handles or the scales. So that's essentially what you see as once I'm finished with most of the filing in step 4, part 3. Then I put the pick back together again just to get a general sense of how much of the metal was sticking out. And I did do a few more refinements in sanding of the metal with the actual metal in the pick. I took the pick itself out. I put the inner extra sheet in there, the brass, and then did a little bit more filing on that just to bring it a little closer to the actual handle edge. So once I had the filler piece pretty close, I put the pick all together. I taped off the pick itself so I wouldn't damage it or scratch it at all if the file had happened to get a little bit out of control, which thankfully it didn't. Put the pick, as you see in step 5, part 2, into the vise, into the leather to help protect it, and then went over it with some different files to bring the metal down even more and closer to the actual wood. I wanted to get it close enough so that it wasn't necessarily completely even with the scales just yet, because I would do that in a final step after gluing all the pieces together with the epoxy. But essentially once all that filing was done, it was down pretty close, as you can see in step 5, part 2. So once I had the filing done for the filler piece, I needed to tape off the scales with masking tape because I was ready to start looking at gluing this all together using epoxy resin. So I essentially put the masking tape on. I used an X-Acto knife to cut off any excess tape that went over too far. Used the rivets from the inside of the scale to push out any tape that I couldn't get cut away with the tip of the X-Acto knife quite properly, and that worked out well. I then went through, I was using Gorilla Glue. I didn't have a lot of experience working with epoxy resin, especially not on something like this. So this was the first time for me. I had my clips ready, put everything together, essentially put the resin on and on all of it and put all the pieces together, clamped it all down together, had put the rivets in and screwed them in tight, which helped as well to help out the clamps. So everything was clamped down pretty good. Once that was all done, I have some clamps that I have hanging from the ceiling, and I was able to just clip the clamp onto the taped part of the pick handle. The clamps don't clamp down so tightly that it would harm the pick blade at all, and it hung there and dried pretty nicely. After a little bit of curing time, I went ahead and took the clamps off, except for at the very tail end piece. I let that cure for a bit longer because there was no rivet at the end of the handle, and I figured that needed a little bit more time to be together, to stay put. So after giving the epoxy resin a good 24 hours to set, I started to take the masking tape off, which was a major pain in the butt. I'll say that. Had to go back over a lot of things just very carefully with the X-Acto knife, especially around the rivets, to get rid of the tape as much as I could. But once that was all done, I took the pick back to the vise to do some more filing on the metal to bring it now closer to the wood. Once I got pretty close to the wood, I then transferred over to using the strips of sandpaper. I started with 400 grit to just, more finely get it down and get my curves exactly the way I wanted them, and even out the pick handle with the metal insert. And then I moved to an 800 grit to just kind of finally, finish that off. So then after cleaning up the pick a bit from the dust and so forth, I prepared it to do some staining on the wood. I did choose this Ipswich pine, and I was trying to go for a color that would really work well with the brass rivets and the brass insert for the handle. I did 2 coats. So what they suggest on this stain is doing 1 coat of stain and then waiting a couple hours for it to really soak in and dry, and then doing a second coat, which is what I did. I'm sure I could have done more coats, but at the point I was at the 2 coats, I felt that was enough. Okay, so once the stain was dry, one of the things I noticed was that I wouldn't exactly call them blemishes, but when I was doing the sanding after having done the epoxy, it would appear as though something got within the wood so that I couldn't see it after sanding, and after cleaning it up, I still couldn't see what looked like somewhat kind of blemishes. And the only thing I can attribute it to is that when I was sanding off the metal, that might have had some epoxy on it, that somehow that got on the sandpaper and got into the wood. But lesson learned. So the next step for me was to apply the beeswax. I had never used beeswax before, so this was kind of a new thing for me. I only did 1 coat of that. It takes 4 hours for it to set before you're supposed to wipe it off, but that seemed to go relatively well, and it went on nice and smooth, and I did like the final result of that. So without further ado, we'll get into the reveal of the finished pick. Okay, so here's the finished pick. Although there were definitely some things that I would have liked to have had turn out a little bit better. For my first pick, I'm pretty happy with this. Next time I've learned a few things. I'll kind of apply my technique a little differently, but that's essentially how that turned out. There we go. So this is a pick that I had made while I was working on this. It's very similar. I'm going to use a different approach. As you can see, they have a very similar type of profile. I'm going to try to use this jewelry wire. This is 20 gauge. To put the epoxy in, and then essentially put this around all along the edges to give it that filler look. I'll probably add a piece of metal somewhere inside the tail here to give it more support, to make it more solid. But we'll have to wait and see how that turns out. I'm waiting for an actual wire straightener so I can get these wires straightened before I lay them in here so that they, go in nice and clean. But overall, happy with the way this first one turned out. Let me know what you think, and I'll be moving on to, after these 2 picks, I think I'm going to go with some straight handled picks for a while, that are closer to the width of the pick itself maybe just a tiny bit wider, because I intend to play with using dyes and mica powder and mica flakes in the epoxy resin to give that color along the spine of the pick to kind of make that pop a little bit. We'll see how it looks. Anyways, thanks for watching this video. Hope you enjoyed it. Take care.